So in today's video, we're going to talk about various models of abnormality. And what we're going to see is that there is not a single uniform or agreed upon approach to understanding mental illness. And as a function of that, we have a whole host of what we call paradigms, which I'll get into, that people look through. And what I will say is that a single paradigm rarely can capture everything that is necessary. So most of us in clinical practice, we rely on several paradigms. But without further ado, let's talk about it. So when we talk about models of abnormality, we are indeed talking about paradigms. And what is a paradigm? It's a framework. It's a set of assumptions that allow us to explain and interpret the observations that we see. And it is useful because these assumptions shape how we collect data, how we do a psychological assessment, and ultimately how we do treatment. So as I go through each of the models of abnormality, you're going to see the assumptions as well as the treatment approaches that are outgrowths of the models. So a long story short, this is what a model of abnormality is. If you go back to our first lecture on the history of mental illness, you will see that at various time periods, there was an agreed upon or singular model of beliefs. So if we were to go back to the Middle Ages, there was a belief in this supernatural model. So there was some level of reliance on demonology. So mental illness, according to this framework, was caused from being possessed by the devil or evil spirits or things like that. And as a function, the treatments that we discussed included exorcism, included trephination, and so forth. That's the Middle Ages. And then as we get a little bit later in history, we adhere to the somatogenic model, which is that mental illness is caused by biological factors exclusively. And then we talked about the psychogenic model. But today, we are in what's called the pre-paradigmatic stage, which means that we're not in a state of uniformity. There are several competing models of abnormality. And as I said, no single model explains everything. So we rely on multiple. The first model we're going to discuss is the biological model. The biological model, as was alluded to, takes on a medical perspective and assumes that one or more physical processes are linked to our behavior. Therefore, the main focus of psychological abnormality is some kind of physical malfunctioning of an organism. And where's the first place we look? We look in the brain. Now, there are other places that we look as well, such as our genetics and so forth, but let's talk about it. When you think of neuroanatomy or brain anatomy, on the microscopic level, the smallest unit of life is a cell. And brain cells, we have a total of 100 billion neurons or brain cells. And that is considered remarkable because if you look even 50 years ago, our understanding about the number of neurons was significantly fewer. And as we get better and better at imaging techniques through staining and whatnot, we're able to see what a neuron is. We're able to see what differentiates one neuron from another due to staining. We also know that we have glial cells, which are designed to be supportive of neurons. And there's a 10-to-1 ratio of glial cells to neurons. So if we have 100 billion neurons, we have thousands of billions of glial cells, or we would call that 1 trillion plus. And these single cells come together to form brain regions. So if we were to talk about a brain structure like the prefrontal cortex, there are many cells or neurons that make up the prefrontal cortex in the brain. So as these cells get put together, we refer to them as brain regions, and we'll get there. So if we were to look at various important brain regions, we could divide the brain into 3 parts: the hindbrain, the midbrain, and a forebrain. The hindbrain is the most posterior and inferior part of the brain. So the 3 parts of the hindbrain are the medulla, pons, and cerebellum. And we believe from an evolutionary point of view, the hindbrain was also the first brain structure to develop, as well as from a prenatal development point of view, the framework, it's one of the first to develop. So what is the medulla? The medulla is a structure in the hindbrain that is responsible for vital functioning. So things like respiration, heart rate, digestion. These vital functions are necessary for survival. And should there be damage to the medulla, one could not survive. So the medulla plays an incredibly important role in the vitality of a person. Interesting to note, the spinal cord turns into the medulla. There is no separation between the spinal cord and medulla. And as a function of that, we know that certain spinal cord injuries put a person at greater risk of death than others. For example, the cervical spinal cord is the highest point of the spinal cord and is right before the medulla. So if you have a cervical spinal cord injury, let's say C1, C2, C3, it is quite possible that that could cause damage to the medulla and impact one's heart rate, respiration, and put them at greater risk for death. Now, the pons is a second structure in the hindbrain, and the pons is, it has a series of ascending and descending fiber tracts, which is important for our somatosensory cortex as well as our motor cortex. So that it plays that role, but it also has a function in the 3 A's: attention, alertness, and arousal. Because one of the fiber tracts that traverses the pons is called the ARAS, ascending reticular activating system, or what many psychology books just call as the reticular formation. And this fiber tract is responsible for filtering important information from distracting information. So treat it like a filter. And this could explain why we use stimulants like Ritalin or Adderall for ADHD. One of the understandings is that with ADHD, your brain is not sifting through that which is central and important versus distractions. And what part of the brain is malfunctioning? The reticular formation. And what a stimulant does is it gives a boost or a kickstart to this part of the brain and allows you to focus better, allows you to filter out important information from distractions. That's the pons. The cerebellum is responsible for balance and motor coordination, and it is loaded up with GABA neurons. And we're going to talk about GABA shortly, but GABA neurons are responsible for inhibition. And when you think of the fine motor control that we use to walk, to keep our balance, we need neurons telling other neurons not to fire so we can have precision. Interesting to note, when a person drinks large quantities of alcohol, it also targets the cerebellum. And alcohol is linked to the neurotransmitter of GABA. So if you have inhibition of GABA neurons, you have inhibition of inhibition. What is that? That's disinhibition. So if you've ever wondered why people will engage in actions that they wouldn't do sober, it's due to alcohol targeting those GABA neurons. That would be targeting the prefrontal cortex, of course, because that's where the judgment and decision making is happening. But it also targets the cerebellum, and it's one of the reasons why in a field sobriety test, a police officer is going to ask you to walk a straight line. If a person cannot walk a straight line, it might be due to alcohol or excessive alcohol targeting the cerebellum. So that's the hindbrain. The midbrain, or mesencephalon, includes several structures, but most importantly, the inferior and superior colliculi. And what these structures are responsible for is promoting survival on a sensory level. So the inferior colliculi, now it says colliculi, meaning it's plural. What does that mean? There is an inferior colliculus on the left hemisphere, as well as an inferior colliculus on the right hemisphere. But what does the inferior colliculus do? Well, it's responsible for processing auditory sensory information, whereas the superior colliculi, again, on both the left and right hemisphere because it's plural, is responsible for processing some visual information. That's the midbrain. The forebrain is the, most anterior part of the brain. And interesting to note, human beings, in terms of proportion of brain, we have more of the forebrain than other animal models, which is pretty cool because the forebrain is going to help us with emotional processing and cognitive processing. So the thalamus. The thalamus is one of those forebrain structures. Can anyone give me an understanding of what the thalamus does? What does the thalamus do?
Professor, is it a relay station?
Right on. Good job, Mohammed. The thalamus, I like to describe as Grand Central Station. And as New Yorkers, you can, from Grand Central Station, you could get anywhere in the country. And you can get to Grand Central Station from anywhere in the country virtually. So it has, relay stations to every other part of the brain. So think of the thalamus as a relay station of inputs and outputs of projection neurons. There is one exception. We know that the sense of smell, or our olfactory sense, does not go through the thalamus. And if you were to ask me why, the answer is we don't know. So we are wired that way, whether it be God or evolution, we don't know. That's the thalamus. The hypothalamus, we have something in a chat. It is not used predominantly for memory. We're going to talk about the hippocampus and its role in memory. So the hypothalamus, your hypothalamus is a thermostat in the brain. So the hypothalamus is responsible for food, or the sense of hunger, thirst, sleep, and sex. So the hypothalamus is responsible for a lot of our basic drives. It is also responsible for temperature. So when we go through psychological disorders, you're going to see eating disorders. The hypothalamus is linked to it. When we see sex-related disorders, you're going to see the hypothalamus is linked to it. Now, the hypothalamus is also a vital part of the endocrine system, and the hypothalamus is responsible for communicating with the pituitary and telling the pituitary to produce and release various hormones. So the hypothalamus is an incredibly important structure. The hippocampus is responsible for things like learning and memory. And what we see when it comes to learning and memory, if there is damage to the hippocampus, it is harder to learn and process information. And with conditions like Alzheimer's disease, which is one of the neurocognitive diseases, we know that the hippocampus is at play. What happens? Well, there are several things that happen to the hippocampus, and to some degree the amygdala, which I'll get to. The hippocampus shrinks, it atrophies. That means that it becomes smaller and there are fewer neurons that are functional. We also know that there are NFTs. No, that is not some kind of crypto investment. There are neurofibrillary tangles, or plaques and bundles, that interfere with neuronal functioning. So we also see tau as a disruption of the hippocampus. So the hippocampus becomes dysregulated as a structure and neuronal communication, so chemical messaging. We'll talk about neurotransmitters and the role of acetylcholine, but you'll see there are issues related to acetylcholine in the hippocampus as well. The amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for fear and rage. And we discovered this fairly early when Kluver and Busey did a research study with primates in which they damaged the amygdala. Now, if you were to think of primates, primates are wired to be aggressive creatures by nature. But if you damage the amygdala, these creatures, these primates, become very docile. They become very submissive, which is out of character. And that research study suggested that it is responsible for things like fear and rage. Now, in Alzheimer's disease, we also see that there are these mood disturbances, irritability, aggression that happens with individuals with Alzheimer's. So there is this heightened aggressiveness, and it's linked to the amygdala. Now, you might say, well, why am I talking about the hippocampus and amygdala as being related to Alzheimer's? Well, what we generally say are brain tissues that wire together, fire together. What do I mean by that? If you were to look at the hippocampus and amygdala, they are right next to one another. And we assume that there are neuronal communications between these two. So if there's damage to the hippocampus, there is likely going to also be damage to the amygdala. So the basal ganglia is another structure right before the cortical structures, and it's responsible for motor functioning as well. And the basal ganglia is linked to another neurocognitive disorder called Parkinson's. So if you ever see a person who has Parkinsonian tremors, it's likely due to a malfunction in the basal ganglia and a neurotransmitter called dopamine, which we'll get to. So these are all the precortical structures. And then we have the cortex, the cerebral cortex, which is the outermost structure of the brain. So if you were a brain surgeon and you were to remove the skull and you were to look at brain matter, what you would likely be looking at is the cerebral cortex. That's your outermost structure. So let's talk about the cortex. The cortex can be divided into lobes or hemispheres. If we are talking about lobes, we're looking at one side of the brain. Now, obviously, you have that same lobe on both sides of the brain, but you see that lateral view on the top picture on the right, and you have your four lobes. Now, a mnemonic to remember your four lobes is FPOT. So frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. And we'll talk about it in general. What do each parts of these lobes do? But we also could look at the brain from a more superior view, and you could see the bottom right picture. There's this big line down the center. We refer to that as the longitudinal fissure, which divides the left and right hemisphere. Now, we do have a dominant and a non-dominant hemisphere. The dominant hemisphere is typically contralateral to your writing hand. So if you are a right-handed individual, your dominant hemisphere is your left hemisphere. What if you're left-handed, like myself? Well, we're the only ones in our right mind, right? It's still typically contralateral. So the dominant hemisphere for left-handed people, at least 50% of left-handed people, is the right hemisphere. The other 50% of lefties have something really remarkable, which is called codominance, which means that we rely on both hemispheres. And you might say, oh, well, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is if in later life a person experiences a stroke and there's damage to one of the hemispheres, there are going to be fewer functional deficits for a left-handed person versus a right-handed person if they have that codominance. So there are some meaningful implications of having codominance. Now, in terms of abnormal behavior, I've been going through this with you, and I went through all of them. Another example of a neurocognitive disorder linked to the basal ganglia is Huntington's. So those are your structures. Now, I do want to, because I didn't put a slide on it, talk a little bit more about the substructures of each of these lobes. So in the frontal lobe, and you do need to know this, so this is important. In the frontal lobe, you have the prefrontal cortex, you have the motor cortex, and you have Broca's area. So what is the PFC, or the prefrontal cortex? The prefrontal cortex is responsible for all executive functioning, planning, decision-making, judgment, personality. So when we think about going back to the alcohol example, alcohol interferes with good judgment. So this is one of the reasons why a person might get really drunk and then all of a sudden wonder how they got onto their friend's couch, or might engage in a one-night stand. And it might be because of that prefrontal cortex, which is supposed to be a brake valve that says, yeah, no, this is not a good idea. Alcohol interferes with it. So the PFC, prefrontal cortex, responsible for judgment, decision-making, planning, all executive functioning. The motor cortex, now, I don't know, can you see my cursor? Yes, no?
Yes.
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 Okay, so I'm going to trace what would be the prefrontal cortex. So you see in the yellow, except for this squiggly line closest to the parietal lobe, you go all the way down and to the left. That is your prefrontal cortex. Now, what is the squiggly line closest to the parietal lobe? Well, that squiggly line is your motor cortex. So again, it's this right here. That is responsible for sending a message from the brain down to the body. So if I want to scratch my nose like I'm doing now, I need a message to go from the motor cortex that's responsible for hand movements down to the thalamus, down to the medulla, into the spinal cord, and out to my hand before I can scratch my nose. Now, you might say, well, there isn't much of a delay. How's it that I can almost instantaneously scratch my nose? Well, it's simple. A neuron can fire in a millisecond. A neuron fires faster than a person can blink. So getting to the ability to move my hand and do what I need to do, it isn't very far. For most people, it's 5-6 feet, right, of communication, pretty instantaneous. So that's the motor cortex. Any kind of motor functioning, you know, moving your hands, twisting your waist, wiggling your toes. It starts with the motor cortex, which is at the most posterior part of the frontal lobe. Now, the third part of the frontal lobe, which is kind of down here in the orbital gyri of the frontal lobe. Can you see this little circle part here? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, so it's down there, is responsible for Broca's area. So what is Broca's area? Broca's area is responsible for speech. Good job, Mohammed. But what kind of speech? Because there are different parts of speech. Right? He put it in the chat. Broca, talk to me.
I know there's two spots for it, but I'm not sure which one is which.
So it's very important to know the distinction. It's okay. So Broca's area is responsible for speech and language production. My ability to give this lecture requires me to have functional speech and language production. And other than all professors who sound like Charlie Brown's teacher from time to time, you can understand what I'm saying, right? So it's not just blah, 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 blah. It's not disjointed. I'm not making typical speech-related errors as I'm producing language. Now, what is cool, I said to you earlier about the concept of things that wire together, fire together. Does it shock you that the motor cortex is here and then you have Broca's area here right next to it? No, because in order to have speech and language production, it isn't just the words. I need to move my mouth. I need proper placement of my tongue in relation to my teeth and so forth. So for me to give this lecture, there are several parts of the frontal lobe that are firing. That's the frontal lobe. Now, we also have in the parietal lobe, so I'm moving to the aquamarine or teal color, the squiggly line that's closest to the yellow is referred to as the somatosensory cortex. And the somatosensory cortex is responsible for receiving neuronal input from the body. So it starts in the periphery, and the neurons go into the spinal cord all the way up to the medulla, thalamus, and ultimately land in the somatosensory cortex. So if someone taps you on your shoulder, how do you know that they've tapped you on the shoulder? Well, there are neurons in the skin that respond to touch, and it sends that impulse of touch and pressure into the spinal cord, up the brain, all the way up to the parietal lobe. And that's where you say, oh yeah, someone tapped me on the shoulder, right? So the perception of touch happens in the parietal lobe. So that's that. And then we have what's called the medial parietal lobule, which is the centralmost portion of the parietal lobe. What is that responsible for? Visual spatial skills. And people who are mathematicians and tremendous artists, physicists require this central region of the parietal lobe to function properly. And there was this cool finding that Albert Einstein, his central portion of the parietal lobe, or what we call the medial parietal lobule, was about 20% larger than the average person. So his brain tissue, responsible for spatial awareness, was significantly greater than yours or mine, perhaps. And that is pretty telling, because when you think about what a physicist needs to understand, the understanding between space or spatial awareness, whether you be a physicist responsible in consulting with building a roller coaster, or if in the case of Einstein, you're trying to understand how time and space are related, right? That awareness happens in the parietal lobe. People like Steph Curry, who is one of the most accurate three-point shooters of all time, in order for him to shoot the ball with the proper arc that it goes in the net, also requires the parietal lobe for that spatial awareness. Now, there are other regions working there. You have the motor cortex, you have the cerebellum. There are different brain regions at play, but certainly the central region is there. I see, Eileen, you have your hand up.
Hi, yeah, I just have a quick question. So as you were talking about Albert Einstein, do we know, was he born with that part of his brain bigger, or
Love the question.
like because if he is born that way, then maybe, only certain people have the ability to be in certain professions. And I don't know, I'm so curious.
I love the question, because it goes back to the debate, nature versus nurture. And from a developmental perspective, very few things are purely nature, very few things are nurture. So is it that you're born a certain way, and you're wired that way through either structure or genetics, or does your environment impact you? And in the case of Albert Einstein, you could argue either, right? Maybe he was born that way and that's why physics came so easy to him. Or maybe because he devoted his whole life to physics, it enhanced that brain region. So Eileen's question is a powerful question. And in the case of Albert Einstein, the answer is we don't know. Why is it that we don't know? Because he donated his brain to science posthumously. There was no imaging in his lifetime. So for him, I can't answer the question. But more generally, I can, Eileen. In general, we do know that some people are born with different wiring than others. But we also know that environmental enrichment and more use of a certain area is going to create more neuronal connections and enhance that brain region. So today we know it's a combination of both. How's that for an answer? With Albert Einstein, we don't have the answer. But with people in general, we know it's a combination of the two.
Yeah, that's no, that's a great answer. Thank you. That's actually kind of what I was thinking, because I do know that, or at least what I would think is that based on your environment, the way that you grow up, exactly as you said, there might be certain parts of the brain that are used more than others, and things like that, as well as personality can be formed, I know, based on environment. So that's kind of what I was thinking, but very interesting. Thank you so much.
You got it. I'll give you an example of someone we believe was wired differently from a young age. Have you ever heard of Temple Grandin? So most people probably have not, but in the autism spectrum communities, Temple Grandin is a celebrity. And her brain imaging is pretty famous because the fiber tracks which are basically axons moving to different parts of the brain, were also more developed in terms of spatial awareness. And very cool individual, but what does she do for a living other than being a motivational speaker and talking about how she functions with autism? Well, she is the second leading designer of slaughterhouses in America. And she's responsible for creating some of the more humane slaughterhouses. Because if you think that an animal doesn't know when they're going in a chute that they're about to be slaughtered, you're mistaken. So she designed slaughterhouses that didn't have them like straightly walking in a line, so to speak, but it curved, and it was a more humane model. And we believe that it's the wiring of the brain that was atypical that helped her have that gift, right? So it does come in both ways, Eileen, but yeah, but practice does help. Another example of how practice might help is that if you were worried about developing a neurocognitive disorder, one of the things we encourage people to do is work on puzzles, whether they be physical puzzles or brain teasers or something like Sudoku. And these can keep your mind sharp, and that activity is going to reduce the risk of Alzheimer's. And there are companies like Luminosity and all of these companies that are have emerged to help with mental acuity. I think I've hit that one pretty hard. Okay. Any other reaction to that before I move on, Eileen?
No, thank you.
Cool. So let's move to the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is the most posterior part of the brain. It looks kind of purple in the top picture. And the occipital lobe is largely responsible for visual processing. And if we were to think about how we see, the neurons the neurons in the back of the eye that make up the optic nerve, they travel to the thalamus. Again, you're hearing the thalamus over and over and over because I said it was a relay station, right? So a lot of things are going to go through it, but it goes to what's called the LGN, or lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, and then it goes to V1, or visual cortex 1. Where is V1? It's in the occipital lobe. So the first cortical processing of vision happens in the occipital lobe. And then, of course, the fact that we number something V1 implies that there is a V2, or there are other parts of the cortex responsible for vision. Okay, so that's the occipital lobe. And then the temporal lobe, if we were to look at the top part of what looks somewhat peach or pink in the temporal lobe, that's what we call the superior temporal gyrus. And there are two things that are there that are important. The auditory cortex, which is responsible for processing hearing or audition. And going back to something Muhammad said, that he knew that there were two major regions, right? In the superior temporal gyrus, we also have Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is responsible for helping us with speech and language comprehension. So, does it shock you that the auditory cortex and Wernicke's area are next to each other? Probably not, right? Because hearing and understanding are intertwined typically, right, with language. So as I am lecturing, I am speaking and you are hearing what I'm saying. So that's going to activate the auditory cortex. And then we need to take these sounds and make them meaningful other than just sounds. Make these sounds into words and understand what these words mean. Well, it's Wernicke's area that is responsible for helping you understand my lecture. So as I am lecturing, I have Broca's area lighting up. And as you are taking notes and listening to my lecture, you have Wernicke's area lighting up. And then underneath the superior temporal gyrus, the vast majority of the rest of the temporal lobe is responsible for emotion functioning. Now, would it shock you that if I told you the limbic system is subcortical and it is near the temporal lobe? It probably would not. Why? Because the limbic system is a donut-shaped structure, or series of structures responsible for emotion or emotional processing. And it sure enough is right next to the temporal lobe, especially when we talk about the amygdala and the hypothalamus. So, and the hippocampus. So you're going to see a lot happening with the juxtaposition of brain structures. Things that are next to one another communicate with one another. So that I covered. I think I covered that. Now, based on that, I'm going to pose a question to the class. What % of your brain do you think the average person uses? You can shout it out or you could put it in the chat.
100.
Okay, so I hear 100, all of it, 100, less than 20. The reality is, it is a myth that we use, and you might hear, oh, you use 10% of your brain. It is a myth. We use 100% of our brain. And every part of our brain is essential and serves a critical function for us. So let's take a basic task like driving and go through the brain structures we covered. The medulla. Do you need the medulla to be functioning at one point or another while driving? Sure. If you're not breathing, your heart's not functioning, you're probably not going to do a good job driving, right? The pons, attention, alertness, arousal. Do you need that while you're driving? Sure, right? So that's what allows you to be safe on the road when someone honks their horn or cuts in on you, right? So you need that. The cerebellum. The cerebellum is something as simple as timing and coordination of your steering wheel, how to make the turn at the right time and not always hit the curb, right? So that kind of thing, the cerebellum is responsible for. The midbrain, we talked about visual and auditory processing. The thalamus is a relay station. So if you're using hearing and vision in driving, well, you have different parts of the thalamus functioning there. The hypothalamus, when you are driving and you're like, gee, I'm really hungry, I need to stop at a rest stop and get something to eat. Well, that was your hypothalamus communicating to you. Your amygdala, when someone cuts you off and you have that irritated response or perhaps road rage, your amygdala is responsible. And we could go through every single part of the brain, and I could show you in a basic task like driving, you're using your whole brain, which is pretty cool, right? So if anyone ever tells you, oh, we use 10% of their brain, you could say, maybe you do, but not me, right? We all use 100%. So that's the neuroanatomical piece of biology. And I covered some of the disorders that might be linked to different parts of the brain. But as we go through all of the psychological disorders, we're going to talk about brain structures, brain pathways. We're going to talk about neurotransmitters and so forth. So let's continue. When we talk about neurotransmitters, right? What are neurotransmitters? They are the brain's chemical messengers. These chemicals are responsible for either predisposing the next neuron to fire or making it less likely to fire, right? So depending on what the neurotransmitter, if it's an excitatory or an inhibitory neurotransmitter, it's going to either make it fire or not fire. And we need these. And as I started to allude, there are different neurotransmitters linked to various mental health conditions. Now, why do we even need these chemical messengers? You might ask that. Can anyone tell me why we need the chemical messengers? Eileen, is that your hand up or was that from before?
Oh, that's probably from before. I didn't know it still stays up.
No worries. Okay. Well, here's what you need to know. Within a neuron, it operates based on electrical properties, right? So when you talk about the concept of an action potential, the electrical voltage becomes depolarized to the point where the neuron fires, right? So within a neuron, it's electrical. Between neurons, it's chemical. Now, the best way to describe our brain cells are like cut electrical wires. So if I were to take my laptop charger, it's plugged into the wall, and cut it. And then I put the other side back to the charging port. Would my laptop get a charge if I cut the wire?
No.
The answer is no. And what are synapses then? They are gaps between neurons. Our nervous system is not a continuous wire. There are spaces between. So the brain has to have a way to keep that electrical impulse going. And what does that? It's these chemical messengers or neurotransmitters that are released into the gap or the synapse, and they bind to the next neuron and trigger a cascade of responses, whether it's going to fire or not fire. So we've overcome in our brain the fact that we don't have one long wire. We have cuts along the way, and we have to still be able to pass a message to where it needs to go. Pretty cool, right? All right. So George said to distinguish between the different types of message and propel electrical signals chemically to one neuron so it converts again to electrical. Yeah, basically when that neurotransmitter binds to the receptor site of the next neuron, it's going to either make it depolarize, which is less negative and makes it more likely to fire, or it's going to hyperpolarize and it's going to make it more likely to fire. But that chemical alters the electrical properties of the next neuron, as George was explaining. Questions on the process of neurotransmitters? So I'd like to talk to you about the big six then. In mental health, we focus on predominantly 6 neurotransmitters. Now, the fact that we call them the big six implies there are other chemical messengers in the brain. There aren't just 6. In fact, there are several dozen chemical messengers in the brain. But we focus on 6: acetylcholine, serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, GABA, and glutamate. These are what we call the big 6. Acetylcholine in the brain is responsible for learning and memory. So if you have low levels of acetylcholine relative to what you should have, that's going to increase the odds of developing Alzheimer's or another neurocognitive disorder. But Alzheimer's, acetylcholine is one of the primary culprits. Serotonin. Serotonin is responsible for sleep-related disorders, mood disorders. So if a person has low levels of serotonin in the brain, they're going to be at greater risk of depression. If they have reasonably normal levels, they'll be fine. Norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline, is responsible for our fight and flight response. So fear-related response, protective, but it's also linked to mania or the manic states of bipolar. So if you had low levels of serotonin and low levels of norepinephrine, you would get depression. If you had low levels of serotonin, but excessively high levels of norepinephrine, you would have a manic state. So again, norepinephrine is linked to mood as well. Dopamine. Dopamine is linked to addiction and pleasure. It's high levels of dopamine or excessively high levels of dopamine is linked to schizophrenia. Low levels of dopamine is linked to Parkinson's. In fact, the drug that we use for Parkinson's is called L-Dopa or levodopa, and it's designed to elevate the dopamine levels to reduce those motor tremors. Then we have GABA. I said to you, GABA was our primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. So if you have disruptions of GABA, you can have excessive firing, and that could result in things like seizures. And same thing with glutamate. Glutamate is our primary excitatory neurotransmitter and is linked to seizures as well. So this is just a quick run through the big 6, right? We also have hormones. So when we talk about the endocrine system, there are hormones at play as well. So we have to be mindful of what hormones do. And remember, we talked about the endocrine system and the pituitary. Well, the pituitary is responsible for synthesizing 8 hormones that are incredibly important for different aspects of bodily functioning. So we talked about the endocrine system. We talked about the hormone system. Let me give you an example of thyroxine. Thyroxine is responsible for proper thyroid functioning. And if you have hypothyroidism linked to low levels of thyroxine, you are going to be at greater risk of depression. Cortisol, which is secreted from the kidneys, is linked to stress-related conditions and anxiety. So really high cortisol levels is going to lead to chronic stress and things like a panic disorder or a stress disorder. So we see, I'm not going through all of our hormones, right? We have growth hormone and a bunch of them, testosterone, estrogen, and so forth. But even our hormones play a role as chemical messengers in the body. Now I see it could also affect our gut. True, that's true. There is a theory that our gut is our second brain, and there's this chemical functioning in the gut as well. So a lot of other conditions could be linked to that as well. So if you've ever taken probiotics and prebiotics and all of that, they're designed to help keep your gut clean. And interesting to note, as it relates to depression, one of the treatments for depression and emerging research for schizophrenia is probiotics. So there's a lot there. Now, I know that if you signed up for this class, you were not expecting such a deep dive on biology. We will not have such a deep dive in every lecture, but I want you to get the foundation so that when I say, oh, the thalamus, oh, the hypothalamus, oh, there's something wrong with the CSF or cerebrospinal fluid or whatever it might be, I want you to be able to say, oh, yeah, I have a lecture I can go back to, and the foundations were already laid. So what about genetics? When we talk about genetics, we typically have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And I say typically because it is possible to have extra chromosomes, and it's also possible to be missing chromosomes. So anyone ever hear of the term trisomy 21? Trisomy 21 is a fancy way of saying Down syndrome. So Down syndrome, instead of having 2 chromosomes on the 21st pair, you have 3. So you have an extra chromosome on the 21st pairing. And that is the contributing factor for Down syndrome. But you could also be missing chromosomes. So by the way, trisomy, if you look at the root tri, T-R-I means 3. So if you think of a triangle, right? 3 sides. Tricycle, 3-wheeler. Trisomy, 3 chromosomes instead of 2. So that's where you have more chromosomes than the typical person does, but you can also be missing a chromosome. How many of you have heard of Turner syndrome? Turner syndrome is a sex-related disorder where, and it happens exclusively in females, right? Where the female looks prepubescent. How does that happen? Well, the standard chromosomal pairing for females is XX. So you have 2 X chromosomes. When it comes to Turner syndrome, there is a, if you do a chromosomal map, it's X blank or X missing. So you only have one X chromosome. And that's why I said it happens exclusively with females, right? Because the X chromosome is responsible for being female. If you had a Y chromosome, so XY is your standard chromosomal pairing for being a male. So X blank, you're gonna be female because there's no Y chromosome. So that being said, that first X chromosome is responsible for primary sexual development. So menstrual cycle, ovulation, the ability to have a child. The second X chromosome is responsible for what's called secondary sex characteristics, which are all of the other post-pubertal changes. So things like widening of the hips, enlargement of the breast, things like the shapeliness that we can detect with a person being post-pubescent. That happens as a function of the second X chromosome. So what does Turner syndrome look like? You can have an adult who looks like a child. And I believe on TLC, there is a show about a young woman who experiences that, right? But so we want to be mindful that how does that happen? It happens because there's a missing X chromosome on that 23rd pairing. All right, so I see there's something in the chat, right? So you can also have extra chromosomes in sex characteristics too. So you can have XXY, you can have XYY, you could have XXX, you can have XXXY, and so forth. So you can have more than a trisomy as well. And George is putting in the chat something that's important, that it isn't just a trisomy you can have even more. But I digress a bit. Now, that is the large-scale chromosomal pairing.
راح الجيم ورايح الشغل بعديها.
Yeah. All right. So, but most disorders are not pure chromosomal abnormalities. Most disorders are genes or genetic-based disorders, which are smaller segments of heredity along a chromosome. And if I were to ask you, how many genes do we have, roughly, what would you guess? How many genes do we have as people? And I'm stopping with that because it's important, and it was a beautiful scientific discovery. Well, we estimate that the human being has anywhere between 20 to 30,000 distinct genes, 20 to 30,000. Now, how do we know that? Because there was something called the Human Genome Project in the 80s and 90s that was able to break genetic code and be able to determine where these genes are. And as a function of the Human Genome Project, we were able to identify over 7,000 genetic-based disorders. Pretty powerful. And if you were a geneticist before the Human Genome Project, you didn't want to do your job because it was very hard. And people thought, and this is the mythology, people thought there were millions of genes. But in reality, if we can break it down to 20 to 30,000, that's quite impressive. And that's where genetic research blew up in a significant way. Now, I talked to you about chromosomes, I talked to you about genes, but I will tell you, when it comes to mental health problems, we know genetics play a role. We know genes play a role. However, it's never 100% of what's going on. So genes don't contribute 100% to a mental health outcome. So depression, yeah, there might be genes linked to depression. Schizophrenia, there might be genes linked to schizophrenia. But even if you have a genetic predisposition for a disorder, it doesn't fully capture what's going on. And to make matters even more complex, when we talk about genetics and mental health, there's something called polygenetic inheritance. And when we say polygenetic inheritance, we are saying that there are multiple genes that interact with one another to cause a particular mental health disorder. And another thing that's really cool about genetics is a person could be wired for a predisposition for a disorder, such as schizophrenia, and never have a psychotic break. And you might ask yourself, well, how does that happen? It's pretty simple. Even if you have a genetic predisposition, genes have to be turned on to be expressed. And with some conditions, if the gene is not turned on, you don't have that outcome. So the environment still matters with genetics. And in low stress environments, a person is less likely to have a psychotic break with schizophrenia, even if they're wired for that gene. Whereas a high stress environment is going to be more likely to switch that gene on. So genetics are really fascinating, really cool. I hope you found some value in that. We also have to recognize the role of evolution, right? So if we were to think about genetics and evolution, you could have a mutation that happened in your lifetime, or you can have a mutation that's passed on, right, from generation to generation. So we see that if you have a family pedigree where there's schizophrenia in the family, and the more immediate or first linked people like parents and grandparents, if it's there, you're going to have higher rates of expression of schizophrenia. So in the family pedigree, the more of these mutations of genes are going to put you at greater odds of having it. So it does run in the family, of course. But that doesn't mean that just because a person develops depression or schizophrenia, it was guaranteed to be passed on from their family. It could be that something happened in that individual's life that mutated their gene, and they're the first generation to express it. I see there's something in the chat. Yeah, I appreciate your support. Thank you. Now, in terms of evolutionary theorists, we try and understand abnormality through this prism. And we do look at the role of genetics, not just in our lifespan, but across the lifespan. And anytime you talk about genetics, there's going to be criticism, there's going to be controversy. Some people don't like this slide in particular, but you know, there is solid research on it. How about viruses, right? Another biological factor. So viral infections can also alter brain structure and functioning. So if a person is exposed to the flu, it is possible that they could develop a whole host of mental conditions. Now, you are at greater odds of things like schizophrenia if you were exposed to the flu prenatally. It's interesting, I can't remember which Nordic country it was in the 1970s, where they had a significant flu outbreak. And then 20 years later, their country had markedly higher schizophrenia rates than their neighboring countries. So something like the flu, viruses can impact your mental health as well. And we also see things like anxiety and mood conditions linked to it as well. So those are the biological origins of mental health problems. Now I'd like to shift gears to things like biological treatments. So when we talk about biological treatments, you will see that the treatments are linked to the hypothesis itself. So we're going to talk about things like drug therapy. Every medication for a mental health condition is targeting a neurotransmitter that is dysregulated. But we'll also talk about ECT, electroconvulsive shock therapy. We'll talk about psychosurgery and go from there. So in an earlier lesson, and George, I think you asked, will we go into different groups of drugs in that lesson? And here's just an intro. But in an earlier lesson, we talked about how mental health hospitals were being emptied from the 1950s forward. One of the reasons why psychiatric hospitals started to get emptied was because we started to have a better understanding of drug therapy. So a lot of the really effective medications for mental health disorders started in the 1950s. And people that might have been hospitalized for the rest of their life, when put on the right medication, could function normally and live in society and enjoy life. Now, there are 4 groups of drugs that we're going to keep coming back to commonly. Are anxiolytics or anti-anxiety medication. So things like Ativan, Xanax, and Valium. These are helpful with anxiety. They're also tranquilizers, right? So they sedate people as well. So it's not uncommon for a person who is taking Xanax or Valium to be a little bit more sedated or more tired. Not to the same degree as, let's say, I don't know, a sleep medication that they can't sleep, but it can make you a little more tired. They also say not to use heavy machinery with these kind of drugs for that reason. And also certainly don't mix it with alcohol because it operates on GABA, which is the same neurotransmitter. So there are a lot of things going on with anxiolytic medication. We also have antidepressant medications. So antidepressant medications, you might hear of Prozac or Zoloft or Lexapro. These are designed to reduce depression levels. Now, I'm going to tell you something that is absolutely cool. We know antidepressant medications help with anxiety as well. And in some case, your antidepressant medication works better for anxiety disorders than actual depression. Any thoughts as to why that might be? Why might depression medication help with anxiety? Answer is simple. They share neurotransmitters. So serotonin is linked to both. Norepinephrine is linked to both. And from a pathway point of view, the HPA axis is linked to both mood and anxiety disorders. So the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So we typically view anxiety disorders and mood disorders, especially depression, as cousins. In fact, within 10 years of being diagnosed with one, you're likely to be diagnosed with the other. So if you start with, let's say, generalized anxiety disorder in your 20s, it's not uncommon for by your 30s to also be diagnosed with major depressive disorder. So, but the medication's the same. We also have mood stabilizers or anti-bipolar medication, things like lithium. Now, lithium is an incredible drug. It's one of the first drugs we discovered that treated bipolar disorder. And guess what? We discovered it by accident. During World War II, sodium chloride was redirected towards the war efforts. So we needed a form of salt. And they started producing this relatively cheap salt called lithium salts. and people started using it in their diet and everyday life. And what we found was that people who were struggling with bipolar disorder, who had manic states and depressive states, these strong extremes, started to become more even keeled. And something as simple as a lithium salt could help them. And that was our first line treatment. Now, we do have a whole host of other mood stabilizers on the market. And for bipolar, it's also not uncommon to have antipsychotic medication. Not because a person with bipolar disorder is psychotic, but we know that antipsychotic medication helps with impulsivity and some of the impulsive behavior that might happen in a manic state. An antipsychotic drug like Haldol or Seroquel might help. So these are classes of drugs. There's the conditions that they were designed to treat, and then there are the off-label uses. For example, Abilify is a medication used for bipolar disorder, and it is also used for kids on the autism spectrum because of the same issue of impulsivity. So it just because you know that a person is prescribed a specific kind of medication, you don't necessarily know why. And you have to be mindful, try and figure out, hey, what condition are you working with? What are your symptoms? That'll give you more insight as to how to treat the individual, not just assume, okay, they're on Seroquel, they must be schizophrenic. It isn't the case because Seroquel is used for other things too. So that is medication. Now, I will tell you, before you engage in drug treatment, for the vast majority of psychological disorders, you're going to start with therapy alone. Not with things like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, but the vast majority of conditions, you're going to start with therapy, and then if needed, add medication. So it's called adjunctive medication. Now, what's interesting is that we take this approach as therapists because what is the side effect of going to a therapist? The side effect is a better life, versus when you take a medication, a pill-based medication, there are a whole host of biological side effects. Not that it's not necessary, not that it's not valuable, but you want to make sure that you're not over-prescribing medication or jumping straight to medication for certain conditions. For example, I believe that with an anxiety disorder, except for with panic disorder is a little tricky, and with depressive disorders, I can use cognitive behavioral therapy and get the same results without the medication. Now, if you were to look at medication, really medication comes in three mindsets. There are some conditions that you never need medication to treat. There are some conditions, as I described, that you use it if therapy alone is not working. And then there are some conditions where you use it along with therapy right from the beginning. As I said, if I'm working with an eating disorder, you don't need medications unless you're dealing with some other condition that's causing the eating disorder. When it comes to anxiety disorders and mood disorders, you don't need to jump to medication right away. Use it if therapy alone is not working. And then when it comes to things like schizophrenia, you want to start with medication, because if a person is in a psychotic state, your therapy is going to be ineffective. You're not going to be able to connect to them. But what happens if you're doing therapy? Let's say you're doing therapy for depression, it's not working. So you say, okay, well, why don't we try Lexapro? You get on Lexapro, that's not working. You try a whole host of medications for depression, and it's still not working. There is another approach, and this approach is only in the most extreme of cases, something called ECT, electroconvulsive shock therapy. So electroconvulsive shock therapy is a process by which we pass electrical current through the brain. Now, we intentionally induce a seizure, and as a function of that, it resets the neurons and the neuronal firing. Now, we tend to see that you go through 7-9 sessions in 2 to 3 days, and you typically start to feel better after a few weeks after ECT. Now, as I said, this is a last resort treatment for severe depression when nothing else is working. So that is something to be mindful as well. You're going to use this in the most extreme of cases. Now, there are some downsides to ECT. It is not uncommon for a person to have some problems with short-term memory for a bit, but the memory does return. Now, another criticism of ECT is that you, every so often, let's say 6 months or a year, you might need booster sessions, which means you're going to be doing these electrical shock repeatedly. And then long term, you have the risk of some form of brain damage or destruction. So you wouldn't jump to ECT right away. And then last but not least, we have something called psychosurgery. Now, a surgery in the brain, you would only do if there's a tumor or whatnot. But historically, we did use surgery for lobotomy, right? Where we cut the connection between the prefrontal cortex and subcortical structures. It helped with mental health problems, but it caused such a disruptance of personality that we said, yeah, no, this is not good. So you will not see too much psychosurgery happening unless you have, let's say, a brain tumor that's pressing against the brain region and altering your mood or functioning. So that is psychosurgery. Now, let's evaluate the biological model and go from there. So what are some of the strengths? What are some of the benefits of looking at mental health conditions through a biological model or paradigm? Well, the first thing is that when you think of psychological science, it gives some credibility or respect to the field. Even mental health practitioners are relying on brain science. It also allows us to consider new approaches to therapy by understanding the brain and the brain functioning. And certainly clinical researchers capitalize on the biological model to be able to better understand the condition. So what are the weaknesses? Well, there are several of those too. If you assume that all behavior can be explained by biological terms, you're going to miss the boat. As I said, there's no singular paradigm that explains everything. So even biological understandings are incomplete. If we were to go back to the question that Eileen asked about Albert Einstein, even, right? That was a nature versus nurture question. Was this brain functioning or enhanced brain functioning due to being born that way or some environmental factor? Well, the environmental factors are non-biological factors, and we'll get there. Another thing we know about biological research is it oftentimes relies on animal models. And the question is whether or not animal models generalize to human beings. There are some questions about that. And then, of course, things like medication, electroconvulsive shock therapy and whatnot, these treatments can have some negative side effects. So I'm gonna stop there, and I think rather than rushing the next model, I'll contain it next class.